Well, hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in once again. It's been a while since my last video. Life's just been pretty busy for me over the last few months since we got home from our last New Zealand workshop. Today's video, one of the biggest hurdles, I guess, that our photography workshop clients seem to come across or struggle with is, of course, editing their landscape photos. Now, in recent times, the last couple of years, since a lot of upgrades to Adobe Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, editing your landscape photos has become a lot easier than it ever used to be. And what if I told you that editing your landscapes is actually easy? It's not that hard anymore. My own editing workflow has changed significantly over the last few years to a very simple and effective technique. And today I'm going to go into the office and jump on my MacBook, and I'm just going to go through a couple of images with you and just talk to you about how easy it really is to edit your landscape photos. So without any further ado, let's head to the office, jump on the MacBook and get started. Okay guys, I've got two images open here now. I've specifically picked two images that are very different. I've got this one on the screen, which is quite a bright, well exposed image, and then I've also got this image, which is obviously a lot darker and a little bit underexposed. So two different exposures, just so I can sort of show you some of the differences between the two. So firstly, I want to talk about your workspace. Now, when you're in Lightroom or Camera Raw, it's pretty important to get your workspace set out the way you want it, and it's also really important to have a workflow. As you go along in your editing journey, it's good to have some sort of a workflow so that you can sort of work to the same routine every time you edit a photo, so the same sort of system, if you like. So having your workspace set out the way you like, it's actually really important. It makes things a lot easier. So over here on the right hand side, where you've got all your different editing panels, we don't always use all of these panels. I know for myself, I only use about 4 or 5 panels. So what you can actually do is you can set these panels out on the right hand side and put them into some sort of order that suits your workflow. So all you need to do is come over to the right hand side here where the panels are, and then just right click, and it will say edit panels to show. If you click on that, it's going to bring all the panels up in this little box here. You'll notice at the bottom here I've got 2 panels that are unticked, the optics and the lens blur, merely because I don't use them. The optics is the chromatic aberration and the lens correction, and I have that set so it automatically does it, so I don't need to see it. Color grading I've got at the bottom there. I don't use it very often, so I've got it at the bottom, and the ones that I use the most I've sort of got up towards the top. And you can move the order of these around too. You just click on whichever one you want to move, it'll go blue, and then you just use your arrows and you can move those up and down to suit, you know, what sort of order you want those in as per your workflow. All right, so yeah, that being said, we'll get started. I'm not going to spend huge amounts of time working on these images because, to be honest, I don't do that anymore. My initial edit is probably about 10 minutes per image, and then I sort of save that image and come back to it a day or two later and maybe a few more tweaks. So I'll show you that initial sort of edit that I do, and you'll see that it's actually really simple. So I've got this is a raw file straight out of the camera. One more thing I just want to quickly mention here. On the right hand side here at the top of the screen where you've got your histogram, you'll notice at the top of the histogram there's a little box in each corner, and I've got those boxes white, like a little box around them. You want to turn those on. So what those little boxes are, you just click on them and they go on and off. One of those is your shadow warning, which means if you clip the shadows or blacks, you'll see the screen goes, in this case it goes blue, so that means you've clipped the blacks or the shadows or the exposure. And then the one on the right hand side is the highlights or the white. So if you overexpose it, for example, you know, you lift the whites up too far like that, or exposure, it's going to show you where it's overexposed. So it's a good idea to have those turned on when you're editing, just so you know if you've pushed something a little bit too far. Okay, next thing I normally do, the color profile, I tend to pretty much just leave it as is. It defaults to Adobe Color. I tend to pretty much just leave that the way it is. Next thing I do is I do an auto adjustment pretty much on every image, an auto adjustment on the shadows and highlights. And to do an auto adjustment, all you need to do is hold down the Shift key on the keyboard, and you'll see everything here all of a sudden says auto, and then you just double click on the little slider and it'll make an auto adjustment based on what it thinks. It's taken the highlights down by 82. We'll do the same on the shadows. I think it's taken the highlights down too far. Probably want them about there, probably about there, 44. Shadows, we'll just leave those there, 54. The next thing I normally do, it depends on the image, but you can make an adjustment on the whites as well. You can lift the white up a little bit. The white slide is always a really good slider for adding, there's a bit of a saying, white is light or white is luminance. So I'll push it a long way. You can see what adding a bit of white does to your image. It can make like quite a big difference. But I normally just add a little bit of white, not too much, probably about there. What's that, 40? We probably won't even go that far. We'll go about 35. Next thing I'm going to do is come down to the calibration panel. Now, this is a really underrated panel. I use this all the time. This is a really good place where you can sort of shift the colors around to do what you want the colors to do. I like the skies that are sort of a real blue, a lighter shade of blue. So I often come to the blue primary. It depends on the image, and just play around with these. So I might pull that blue primary down a little bit, like down to maybe 24. This is a wild guess here. I'm just having a quick go. Yeah, about 20, I reckon. And, you can just play with these. This can shift your colors around and give you that sort of pinky peachy look in some of your sort of warmer tones. You can even potentially try the green. I'm not going to do much with the green here, I don't think. Maybe a little bit. The red, I don't move much. You can have a play with it, see what it does. It makes the pink highlights a bit pinky. You could probably take that down a little bit. The next one I want to show you is how to give your colors a really natural saturation pop without looking too sort of fake or too oversaturated, and that is here in the in the calibration panel, the blue primary, the one at the bottom. If you pick up the saturation slider there, that's always a really good way. I'm just lifting it up a long way so you can see. That's a really good way to give your colors a really nice pop. And then with that, you're sort of going anywhere between 25 and 60, sort of in that sort of range. Just a good way to give your colors a little bit of a pop. So let's just take it up to about, let's do it a fair way so you can see. We'll go up to 45. That's the best way to give your colors just that nice natural pop. The next thing I want to do is go into the color panel. And we're going to just play with the color on this image. Now, I can tell straight away that this image is a little bit too much in the cool tones. It's a bit too blue, a little bit too cold. So what I tend to do here, just to balance out my my color or white balance, is, this sounds weird, but it works. I take the vibrance and the saturation sliders and I take them all the way to 100. Now, that sounds crazy. I'm not going to leave them there. I take them both right up to 100, and then I just play around with a color temperature slider, and you'll notice, like in these clouds here in the right hand top, those sort of pinky clouds, you still want to hold that sort of texture, or that texture, I guess, in those clouds. So you could probably push that up to about there, I reckon. And tint, probably don't need to do much with the tint on this one. If you push it to the right, you're getting very magenta. Left, you're getting too blue. Where it is pretty good where it is. It was on 0, so we're going to leave it. That's a good way to set your white balance or your color temperature. So I'll just 0 the vibrance and the saturation back again. You can see it's just sort of warmed it up a little bit. If I click the color on and off over here, where the little color word is on the right hand side, there's a little eyeball on and off. You can see it's just warmed those highlights up. I think we could actually warm them up a little bit more, probably about there, I reckon. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a little bit of warmth into the image. So I'm going to use a brush for this. So on the right hand side, on the 4th tab down is your masking, and that's where all your masks are. I tend to use the brush a lot. Now you can just click on brush, or you can also hit K on the keyboard and your brush will come up on the screen, and you can change the size of that brush just with your open and close brackets on the keyboard. The other thing is the brush settings. I always have the feather at 100 and the flow at 100, and then the density I sort of range that anywhere from about 75 to 95. At the moment it's on 86. That's fine. So I'm just going to come in here. On this brush, I'm going to lift up the color temperature a little bit. So just warm it up a little bit. We'll go plus 15. Lift up the saturation a little bit, probably plus 9. And I'm going to roll down to the dehaze, and I'm just going to go into the minuses here, about minus 15 on the dehaze. And we're just going to bring that brush in. We'll start off with a pretty big brush. I'm just going to put a couple of slashes in there, which will be that sort of nice bright light bleeding in from the outside, and then just bring the brush size down a little bit and just sort of brush that in just into those highlights there. Just change that brush size there, bring it down a bit in here. We're just trying to make that warm light coming in from the side look a bit more natural. And you can see over here, if I hold my mouse over the mask, it's showing all the red area. That's where the areas that have been affected by the brush. And on the right hand side of that, the little eyeball, you turn that on and off. You can see it's just showing that warm light that I've sort of painted in there. Next thing I'm going to do to this image, and I talk about this all the time, when I edit my images, I like to break them down into 2, as I call, zones. And what I mean by that, one zone is the sky and the other zone is the foreground. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to my masks on the right hand side, the 4th one down, create new mask. And the top one there says select sky. Sorry, that's select subject, sorry. Create new mask, select sky. It's the second one, sorry. If we click that, that's going to select the sky. We can make an adjustment to the sky if we like. We're not going to do that at the moment. What we're actually going to do is we're going to invert this mask so that it's only the foreground and not the sky. So all we need to do there is hit X on the keyboard, and that will invert the mask so it's only the foreground and not the sky. Now what I want to do here is bring a lot more light into this middle area of the image, into the snow, the mountains, the icebergs and that sort of thing. So what I've done there with my foreground mask, if I come over here to the right hand side where the mask is, next to the mask there's 3 little dots. Now if I click on that dot, it's going to give me an option, the 4th one down, where it says intersect mask with. I'm going to go intersect mask with brush. Now what will happen here, wherever I brush, it'll only come into the foreground mask, not into the sky. So I'm going to lift the exposure up a little bit. I'm going to lift up the blacks a little bit, and I'm going to lift up the whites a bit, and I'm just going to brush that in just into the middle sort of area of the image, the mountains, the icebergs, that sort of area there. So, and you can see that if I hover over that mask, it's showing me that it's only affecting the foreground layer mask that I made. It hasn't bled out into the sky. So if I turn that mask on and off, you'll see the huge difference that's made. I'm going to leave the foreground quite dark in this because there's not a lot happening in the foreground here really. And you know, by having that foreground a bit darker, it's sort of leading me out into the background more, out into the mountains and onto the icebergs and where the warm light is. You'll see over here on the right, there's 2 little red areas where the whites have clipped. We can come back and tweak those later, just a little bit of a brush or a bit of dehaze or something in there. That's not too big of a deal at the moment. That in a nutshell, would be probably my first pass on this image. I'd probably save the image there and then come back and revisit it later, and I can make some other adjustments as I go along. But essentially that's my basic editing technique. Pretty simple, right? And if I click before and after, that's where I started there. That was the raw file, and that's where I've gone to. So from there to there, and I've done very little to the image. One other thing I might just show you is I think the highlights on the right-hand side here, the warmer sort of highlights in the sky, you could sort of pull the highlights down a little bit just in those brighter areas, and you could do that just with a radial filter. You could come to the right-hand side here, fourth one down, new mask, radial gradient, and you could just bring a radial filter in from the side. You can change the size of this to suit, whatever you want, probably something like that. And then inside of that, we're going to come down to the curves, and we can actually click on this little adjuster on the right hand side of the curves, this little sort of plus sign, and we can hover that into the image where the really bright area is. It's the small round circle that you're looking, it's the target, it's targeting a certain tonal area. So you just click that in the bright part there, and it's put a little dot on the curve over here, and you could just bring those curves down a little bit there, not much, and you'll see that's just bringing that brighter area down a bit there, like that. One more thing I'll show you on this image before we move on to the next one is how you can do a mid-tones adjustment. This image, actually I'm not going to do it on this image, it doesn't really need it. I'll show you how to make a mid-tones curves adjustment on the next image actually, which is a handy tip as well. But in a nutshell, that's my editing technique, or my first pass editing technique. It's pretty basic. I've made 3 adjustments in the light module, a few in the calibration panel, and then I've got 3 different masks there. So it's pretty simple, and I went from there before and after to there. Okay, let's move on to the second image. We'll open up the second image. Now this image is a lot brighter, so pretty easy image to work with this one. It's sort of really well exposed. It's not blown out, it's well exposed, it's in focus, it's a pretty solid composition. One thing when you're out in the field, it's always really important to just take your time and make that extra effort to get all the little fundamental things right. What I mean by that is make sure your composition looks good, make sure you haven't overexposed or underexposed your image, make sure the exposure is correct by shooting off your histogram, and make sure you focus correctly. Normally, if you focus on a landscape about 1/3 of the way into the image, as in from the bottom of the scene about 1/3 of the way in, you're going to be pretty much okay. Okay, back to this one. First thing here that I notice, I think the foreground's too bright. So the water on the lake in the foreground's too bright. So I'm just going to do a linear gradient at the bottom, and I'm just going to darken that foreground. When I bring in my linear gradients from the outside, I always start them quite a way out of the frame like this. The bigger the gaps are between these dots on the gradient, the more feathered or graduated it is, and the more subtle it looks. So I'm just going to drop down the exposure a bit there. I'm going to go a fair way down on this, like 2.5 stops like that. You can see that darkening that foreground's just taking your eye away from that bright water and sort of made you look at the mountains more. Next thing, we go back to the light panel. We'll just do the basic adjustments on the shadows and highlights. Once again, I'll probably just do an auto adjustment. So if I hold one finger down on the shift key and double click the highlights, it's taken them down 37, and we'll do the same on the shadows. It's brought those up by 65. That looks pretty good to me. There's some dark shadows in here, but it's sort of brought those up fairly nicely. Next thing I'm going to do, it's very well exposed, this image, so I don't need to change exposure at all. Come down again to the calibration panel. And once again, I like those sort of pinky peachy tones, those sort of more almost turquoisey type blues. So I'm going to bring the blue primary hue down a bit. You can see it's sort of really making the trees that nice orangey red color, which I happen to like. Bring that down by probably about 20, and I'll see what happens if we lift the green Yeah, I sort of like what it does on the green as well. If I lift the green up by about the same, probably 20, it's just made the colours a bit more sort of harmonious. I sort of like that. Saturation, blue primary, you could give that a bit of saturation. I don't know if you need to. The saturation's pretty good as it is. I don't know if I will. I'll probably just leave it where it is. I like pretty subdued colours. The next thing I'm going to do here is probably just do a whites adjustment. I can probably lift the whites up a little bit on this image. I'm going to zoom in on the snow at the mountain at the back there just to make sure, go back to the light panel there, go to the whites, just to make sure when you lift the whites up that you don't lose detail in the brighter areas. So like in this white snow, I don't want to lose detail. So I can lift the white up probably to about there, 23, that's probably far enough. You can see I've still got all the detail in the snow there. So I take that back to normal size. You'll see what happens when I lift that white. It's just really making all those colours pop a bit. But I just took it up to about 23. That image is well on the way now. Like, we didn't do much to that image, but it didn't need it. If we just click before and after, you can see the difference it's made already, and there's not a lot of work gone into the editing. One more thing that I was going to show you that I mentioned in the last image is how you can sort of give your tones or your mid-tones a bit of a pop. Mid-tones are essentially all those tones that aren't really dark and aren't really light, those ones in the middle, mid-tones. So if we come down to the curve, we can do what we call a mid-tone adjustment. Now, this is what people would call an S-curve. You hear people talk about an S-curve. What you can do, you can just come over and lift up the brighter areas a little bit, drop down the darker areas a little bit like so, turn that on off. You can see that's really given the mid-tones that real strong punch. The other way you can do it is like I showed you there before. You can come over to the little target tool on the right where the little plus sign is, and you can actually target the 2 points you want to lift. You can come over to the wider part of the snow, not the real white part, but just a bit less white, maybe about there. You can see it's put a dot there on the histogram, and then we'll come into sort of the darker areas, but not the blacks. So probably somewhere like there. And you can see that's put a dot on the histogram as well. So you come over to the lights and just lift that one up a little bit, about there, and then just come back to this one, pull it down a little bit, like there. Could probably lift that one up a little bit more. And that's what you call, that's a mid-tone S-curve. So if I turn that on and off, you see the difference that's made. It's really given a punch of contrast to the image. If you didn't like that in the whole image, you could still do that same sort of adjustment on a mask. You could use a brush or a radial filter and just put it into the areas that you want it to go to. That's about it, guys, in a nutshell. 2 images, super quick edits, but honestly, that is the extent of my editing workflow these days. It's pretty untechnical. We've gone from that to that, and then over here on this image, we've gone from there to there. There's one quick thing I'm going to show you before we go, and that is how to use the new AI remove tool. So let's just zoom in on this image, and we'll come over here to where this little dark sort of patch of water is on the right hand side of the image. We want to take that out. It's a little bit distracting. I sort of don't like dark distractions on the edge of the frame. So if we go back to the main, get all our main sort of panels back here, there's actually one here which is the third one down. We're going to click on that. It looks like a little rubber, remove. And this is the new generative AI remove tool. This thing works amazing. Now, one thing I'll tell you about this, you need to be connected to the internet or have a Wi-Fi signal for this to work, because it actually uses data for the AI technology to work. So you've just got the first one, you've got 3 different ones there. You've got a little Band-Aid, a little clone, or the Band-Aid's a heel, or the first one says remove. So you just come over to the image and you'll have this little brush up on the image. You can change the size of that with your open and close brackets. We're just going to try and get rid of this little piece of water here where the dark sort of ripple is in the water. Paint over it like that. You'll see it'll probably light it up pink. We're going to paint over it a bit more like that. And then we need to click apply over here on the right hand side, and hopefully that will just make that disappear. This is there you go, look at that, it worked perfectly. That's a great way of removing items. Hope you learned something, guys. Thanks for watching. I just want to end by saying today that if you've found some value in this video and you want to take your editing techniques even further, I've recently released a new photo editing video tutorial which is available on my website. I'll post a link down below in the comments of this video. It is my complete editing workflow and all the techniques and tools that I have in the tool belt for that editing workflow. It's almost 2 hours and 4 chapters of all sorts of information about my complete editing workflow. It's a very in-depth video. You've got 2 chapters that cover Lightroom and Camera Raw, and then you've got 2 chapters that cover Photoshop. So if you'd like to get a copy of that in-depth video, as I said, there'll be a link in the comments to this video. That's about it, guys. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you've got some value out of this video. Hopefully there's some more videos coming from me in the near future. We're actually about to head off to Iceland next week for our Iceland workshop this year. We're very excited about that. So hopefully we might even have a bit of content coming from Iceland. As I always say in all my videos, if you've enjoyed the video, please do me a big favor. Go ahead, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought of the video. And as I always say, don't take life too seriously. Stay curious and take care of yourselves. And we'll see you guys again real soon.